February the 5th, 2024. Buckingham Palace releases a statement. Short, clinical, precise. 3 sentences that stop the entire country dead in its tracks. King Charles III has cancer. Not a cold, not exhaustion, not the kind of vague, carefully worded non-announcement the palace has spent centuries perfecting. Cancer. An actual, undeniable, impossible-to-spin medical diagnosis delivered to the British public on a grey winter morning. And the institution that has survived world wars, abdication crises, and decades of tabloid warfare had absolutely no choice but to say the word out loud. The palace does not say which type. They never say which type. They say he is positive about his treatment. They say he will step back from public duties. And then, silence. The great, impenetrable marble silence that the British monarchy has deployed like a weapon for 300 years. But here is what that statement did not tell you. In the weeks that followed that announcement, Prince William began attending meetings he had never attended before. Briefings that belonged to a king. Private audiences with prime ministers, with foreign dignitaries, with the kind of people who do not waste their time with anyone who is not the most important person in the room. And William, the man who has spent his entire adult life standing slightly behind his father, slightly deferential, slightly in weight, walked into those rooms and sat down at the head of the table. The handover that nobody officially announced had already begun. And if you are new to this channel and you have just stumbled onto this video, stay right there. Because what we do here is not gossip. It is not speculation. It is not the kind of breathless royal commentary you get from people who have never been within a mile of a palace source. What we do here is forensic. We follow the evidence. We read about constitutional mechanics. We watch the body language and the briefing schedules and the carefully orchestrated photograph choices. And then we tell you without the spin, without the PR gloss, exactly what is actually happening behind those gates. If that is the kind of truth you came here for, hit like right now, subscribe to this channel, and turn your notifications on, because this story is moving fast, and you cannot afford to miss what comes next. Now, let us go inside. To understand why February 2024 changed everything, and I mean everything, not just for the royal family, but for the constitutional architecture of this country, you need to understand what Charles had been building since the moment he took the throne in September 2022. Because Charles III did not arrive at the monarchy as a passive inheritor. He arrived as a man who had been waiting 73 years for this moment, and had spent most of those years designing exactly what he intended to do with it. His singular obsession, the one driving principle behind everything he did in those first months as king, was what he called the slimmed-down monarchy. Fewer working royals, lower cost to the public purse, a tighter, more disciplined, more sustainable crown that could survive the republican pressures of the 21st century without looking like an expensive relic of the 19th. His vision was precise, almost architectural in its clarity. Himself, Camila, William, Kate. A small, carefully selected group of working royals carrying the full institutional weight of the crown. It was, frankly, an elegant solution to an institution that had grown bloated and distracted and scandal-prone during the final years of his mother's reign. Charles looked at the chaos of Andrew, the departure of Harry, the cascading tabloid disasters, and he said quietly, deliberately, "We are going to strip this back. We are going to make it lean. We are going to make it mean something again." What Charles could never have predicted, no contingency plan, no palace briefing document, no constitutional lawyer could have mapped, was that he himself would become the first variable to fail in his own equation. January 2024. The king enters the hospital for a procedure related to an enlarged prostate. The palace calls it routine, and perhaps it was, initially. But during that procedure, something else was discovered. Something that the palace's legendary communications machine, the most sophisticated image management operation in the world, could not spin into nothing. Something that forced even that institution, The one that once refused to lower the flag at Buckingham Palace when Princess Diana died. That is how committed they are to showing no vulnerability. Force them to use a word they almost never use publicly. Cancer. And in that single moment, in that single clinical statement on a February morning, Charles's carefully architected, slimmed-down monarchy lost its most essential component: the king himself. The question that every senior advisor inside the palace, every query, every private secretary, every constitutional expert on speed dial immediately began asking was not, will he survive? That question, deeply human as it is, was almost secondary in the cold machinery of institutional crisis management. The question was starker than that. The question was, who runs this now? Within 72 hours of that statement dropping, the answer began to emerge. Not in any press release, not in any official announcement, but in the schedules. Always in the schedules. William begins stepping into roles that are, constitutionally speaking, reserved for the sovereign. Not officially, not with fanfare, but the engagements tell the story with absolute clarity if you know how to read them. Throughout 2024, Charles conducts limited public duties, carefully staged, carefully timed. Always brief, always photographed from angles designed to project vitality and strength. The palace reviews every image of the king before it reaches the public. Every appearance is a calculated communication look. He is fine, he is working, the institution is stable. But behind those meticulously managed appearances, something else is happening entirely. William's schedule expands dramatically, not incrementally, dramatically. He begins meeting with military chiefs. He represents the crown at international commemorations, the kind of events that send a signal to foreign governments about where the real weight of British institutional authority now sits. He takes on state-level briefings. He receives intelligence summaries, senior royal correspondents, people who have covered this institution for decades, who understand the difference between a ceremonial expansion of duties and a genuine transfer of operational authority, begin to note something that they find difficult to articulate without sounding alarmist, but which they are seeing with their own eyes. William begins to carry himself differently. The slight hesitancy that marked his earlier years in public life, that unconscious deference to his father that was always visible in the way he positioned himself physically, the way he let Charles enter the room first, the way his eyes would check with the king before he spoke, begins to disappear. And then comes the moment that crystallized everything. The moment that, for those of us who track constitutional mechanics rather than celebrity gossip, confirmed that this was not a temporary arrangement, not a holding pattern, not a polite fiction maintained while a father recovered and a son waited. In the middle of 2024, Charles makes a decision. A private decision, never publicly announced, never subject to parliamentary scrutiny, conducted through the quiet administrative channels that the monarchy has used for centuries to move power without anyone noticing. He delegates to William the authority to act on certain constitutional matters in his absence. The Councillors of State, a formal mechanism embedded in British constitutional law, a mechanism that most people in this country have never heard of and could not explain if you asked them, are quietly expanded and activated with new operational significance. Now, for those of you who are not constitutional lawyers, and frankly, why would you let me translate that into plain English? A Councillor of State in the British system is a senior member of the royal family authorised to carry out certain official functions on behalf of the sovereign when the sovereign is unavailable. Signing documents, receiving ambassadors, carrying out duties that require the formal presence of the crown. It is a mechanism that has existed in various forms for centuries, designed precisely for moments of royal incapacitation. What Charles did in 2024 was not just activate that mechanism. He activated it with William at its centre, with a scope and frequency that went well beyond any previous peacetime use of the provision. What that means, stripped of all the constitutional language, stripped of all the palace euphemism, is this. William is not waiting to be king anymore. William is the operating king. The crown has not moved. The title has not been transferred. But the power, the real, functional, institutional power that the crown represents, has already moved. It moved quietly. It moved without a ceremony or an announcement or a single moment of public acknowledgement. But it moved. And this is where it gets complicated. Because the transfer of power, even an unofficial one, even one conducted in the careful shadows of institutional discretion, does not happen in a vacuum. It creates winners and it creates losers. And the winners and losers of this particular shift are going to shape British royal history for the next 50 years. Winner, unambiguously, comprehensively, devastatingly, for everyone else. William. He is now the gravitational centre of the British monarchy in a way that goes far beyond his formal title as Prince of Wales. Every senior courtier inside the palace knows it. Every foreign government with an embassy in London knows it. Every private secretary, every equerry, every aide who has spent their career reading which way the institutional wind is blowing knows it. The question of who matters inside the House of Windsor has been answered not with a press release, not with a ceremony, but with the quiet, inexorable logic of power finding its own level. Loser, already exiled, already stripped, now watching from 5,000 miles away in Montecito, California. Harry. This is the dimension of the story that the mainstream media consistently underplays, and I want to give it the forensic attention it deserves. Because Harry's position in 2024 and into 2025 is not simply that of an estranged family member. It is that of a man who made a strategic calculation that he could build an independent platform, generate enough cultural power and public sympathy, and use that leverage to negotiate his way back into relevance. That calculation was always marginal, but it depended, fundamentally, on there being no single dominant figure inside the institution he left. Now there is. William, increasingly, is not just the heir, he is the de facto crown. Every legal case Harry pursues, every interview he gives, every project Meghan launches, every memoir excerpt that resurfaces in a slow news week, it all lands differently now, because the target of all of it is no longer the future king. He is the operating king. And you cannot fight a shadow war against someone who has already won the ground war. Loser, dug in at Royal Lodge like a man who has read the history books but somehow missed the chapter on inevitability. Prince Andrew. The standoff over Royal Lodge, Andrew's grace and favour residence on the Windsor estate, a property of considerable size and considerable cost, continues throughout 2024 and into 2025. And it is a standoff that tells you everything you need to know about the internal dynamics of the new monarchy. Charles wants Andrew out. Frogmore Cottage was already reclaimed from Harry and Meghan. The logic is consistent, it is public, and it is ruthless. The slimmed-down monarchy does not have room for embarrassments living in royal grace and favour properties at the taxpayer's expense. Andrew refuses. He digs in. He makes statements. He makes appearances at church services on the Windsor estate, photographed defiantly in his own driveway. But here is the critical detail that almost nobody in the mainstream commentary has picked up on. The man now driving those eviction conversations, the man whose allies, whose advisors, whose vision of a clean and credible modern monarchy is increasingly shaping palace strategy, is not Charles. Charles is dealing with his cancer treatment. Charles is managing his health. The man pushing the Royal Lodge agenda, the man whose institutional future is most directly threatened by a disgraced Duke of York continuing to occupy prime real estate on the Windsor estate, that man is William. And Andrew has no constituency left. He has no allies inside the working monarchy. He has no public support. He has the property and the stubbornness, and eventually, neither of those will be enough. And then there is the wild card, the variable that nobody quite knows how to account for: Queen Camilla. Because Camilla's position in this new configuration of royal power is genuinely, fascinatingly complicated, and I want to spend a moment on it because it illuminates something important about how this institution actually functions beneath the ceremonial surface. Camilla holds the title of Queen. She is the King's wife. She has survived the most sustained and vicious public relations assault in modern royal history. The decades of Diana comparisons, the public hostility, the opinion polls that would have broken most people. And she has arrived at the position of Queen Consort with a composure and a strategic intelligence that her critics consistently underestimated. She is not stupid. She is not irrelevant. She has built genuine relationships with the kind of people who matter in British public life. But as Charles's presence in day-to-day royal operations shrinks, and it has shrunk, whatever the palace says about his recovery, Camilla's position inside the institutional hierarchy enters a kind of constitutional grey zone that the textbooks were never quite designed to address. She is not the Queen Mother. That role does not exist while a king is still living. She is not a Councillor of State in the operational sense that William now is. And sources close to the palace, people who understand the internal geography of that institution, who know which offices communicate and which offices do not, have noted, carefully and quietly, that the dynamic between Camilla's operation and William's operation is not always harmonious. Two offices, two agendas. Significant but unspoken tension over who speaks for the crown at any given moment. And a king who is, by all credible accounts, not always well enough to referee that tension personally. Two power centres, one palace, and a constitutional framework that was designed for orderly succession, not for the gradual, ambiguous, real-time transfer of authority that is happening right now. This is the hidden war that nobody wants to name, and it is playing out every single day in meetings you will never hear about, in decisions that will never be attributed, in the body language of aides who have been told whose calls to return first. Now, let us talk about where this goes, because this is where forensic commentary has to be most precise, most careful, and most honest about what we know and what we are extrapolating. And I want to be completely straight with you about that distinction. Here is what we know. Charles III has cancer. He has been undergoing treatment. His public duties have been reduced to a fraction of what a fully operational sovereign would conduct. The formal constitutional mechanism of the Councillors of State has been activated and expanded, with William at its operational core. William's schedule, his briefings, his relationships with foreign governments and military leadership and the Prime Minister's office have all been recalibrated to reflect his central role. These are not speculations. These are documented facts, cross-referenced across multiple senior royal correspondents, constitutional lawyers, and palace-adjacent sources. Here is what we can reasonably extrapolate. The transfer of power that began in February 2024 cannot be fully reversed. Not because Charles will not recover, he may, and that is entirely possible, and anyone who tells you they know otherwise is lying to you. But because institutions do not run on titles, they run on relationships. And the relationships that matter inside the British constitutional system, the relationships with foreign governments, with military leadership, with the Prime Minister's office, with the senior civil service, with the intelligence community, those relationships have been recalibrated toward William. That recalibration does not simply reverse itself when the man at the top returns to better health. These things are not switches. They are geological shifts, slow, structural, and permanent. William has tasted operational authority, not the ceremonial version of it, not the ribbon cutting and the state banquets and the formal engagements that fill a royal schedule, the real kind. The kind that comes from sitting in rooms where actual decisions are made, from building direct relationships with the people who run the apparatus of the British state, from being the person that the phone rings for when something needs a royal imprimatur quickly and the king is not available. His advisors have built systems around that authority. His office has grown to accommodate it. The infrastructure of a working sovereign is assembling itself around a man who does not yet formally hold the title. And consider what that means for the long game that every monarchy, every dynasty is always playing, even when it pretends to be focused on the immediate present. When William formally ascends the throne, whether that is 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, because we genuinely do not know and anyone who pretends otherwise is guessing, He will not arrive as a new king learning the job. He will not need the kind of institutional orientation period that most new monarchs require. He will not be establishing relationships with foreign heads of state for the first time, or learning the rhythms of state-level briefings, or navigating the unwritten protocols of the relationship between the crown and the elected government. He will already know all of that. He will have been doing all of that. He will arrive as a king who has already been king in every meaningful operational sense. There is a concept in political science, and bear with me here because this is precisely the kind of analytical framework that royal commentary almost never applies to this subject. There is a concept called the shadow state, the parallel structure of power that operates alongside the formal, visible, publicly accountable structure of governance. In democracies, we see it in the relationship between elected governments and the permanent civil service. In monarchies, it operates differently. But what is happening right now inside the British royal family has characteristics of exactly that phenomenon. A shadow crown, a parallel sovereignty, a man exercising the functions of a king while another man holds the formal title. And the British public, broadly, genuinely, with very few exceptions, does not know this is happening. They see the managed photographs of Charles at engagements. They see the carefully worded palace statements about his treatment and his recovery. They see William at events, yes, but framed as the supportive son, the capable heir, the loyal second. They do not see the briefings. They do not see the constitutional machinery. They do not see the quiet, deliberate, irreversible accumulation of institutional authority that is taking place behind a communications operation that is, by any objective measure, one of the most sophisticated on the planet. Which brings me to the question that I think cuts to the very heart of what this moment represents. Not just for the royal family, not just for the monarchy as an institution, but for the relationship between the crown and the people of this country. The people who are constitutionally not as subjects in the Victorian sense, but as citizens of a modern democratic state, are the people who are constitutionally the ultimate source of the legitimacy that the crown depends on for its survival. At what point does the public deserve to be told the full truth? At what point does the management of royal optics cross a line from legitimate institutional discretion, the kind of discretion that any head of state is entitled to around personal medical matters, into something more troubling, into a sustained, deliberate, institutionally coordinated effort to obscure a fundamental constitutional reality that the person formally acknowledged as the operating head of state is not, in any meaningful functional sense, the person actually doing the job? I am not asking that rhetorically. I am asking it as a genuine question, because there is a serious argument, and I have heard serious constitutional scholars make it, that the councillors of state mechanism and the institutional norms around royal discretion give the palace perfectly adequate legal cover for exactly what it is doing. The mechanisms exist. They are being used correctly. There is no law being broken. But legality and transparency are not the same thing. And the monarchy's long-term survival in a democratic society depends not on legal cover, but on public trust. And public trust, in the 21st century, in the age of the information environment we all inhabit, is a more fragile and more contested resource than it has ever been. The palace knows this. William knows this. The advisors who are building the infrastructure of his operating authority know this. And the decisions they are making right now about how much to reveal and how much to manage, about how explicitly to acknowledge the transfer of power, and how much to let it proceed in the quiet shadow of institutional discretion. Those decisions are going to define the relationship between the British monarchy and the British public for a generation. The Crown does not skip ahead. That is not how it works. The constitutional formalities exist for reasons, and those reasons are not merely ceremonial. They encode hard-won lessons about what happens when power transfers without legitimacy, without public acknowledgement, without the kind of transparent process that gives institutions their durability. But the Crown can quietly, invisibly, behind doors that never open to cameras, through mechanisms that most citizens do not know exist, lean forward. It can transfer the substance of power while maintaining the form. It can recalibrate without announcing the recalibration. It can ensure that the man who will be king arrives at that formal moment already in possession of everything a king needs, having already built everything a king requires, having already become, in every way that matters, exactly what the title will eventually confirm. And right now, that is exactly what is happening. The crown is leaning forward, all the way forward, in the direction of William. So here is what I want from you. Down in the comments below, I want your honest answer to the question I just posed. If King Charles's health continues to decline, and William continues to quietly, methodically consolidate every lever of institutional power at his disposal, at what point does the British public deserve to be told, plainly and directly, who is actually running the monarchy? Is the palace's current approach, managed, controlled, technically legal but fundamentally opaque, acceptable? Or is it a betrayal of the transparency that modern democratic legitimacy requires? Drop your answer below. I read every comment. I take this seriously, and I want to hear where you stand on it. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. Turn on your notifications, because we are going to keep going. We are going to keep pulling at this thread. And in our next video, we go even deeper into a story that the palace is working extremely hard to keep quiet. A story about the conversations happening right now inside the highest levels of the British establishment about the future shape of the monarchy. The timeline nobody is officially acknowledging, and the man at the center of it all, who is, day by day, decision by decision, quietly making himself indispensable to an institution that was built to outlast any individual, but which has never faced quite this particular test before. Stay with me. We are only just getting started.